Hello. All right. I said in one of my last videos that I've missed making my Off 66 videos. So I was thinking about maybe like a new series I could do that's a little bit more shorter content. Just so I can keep up some of our conversations and some of the things that I know I end up talking to people about. First of all, I'm a little worse for the wear. I just got back from IT Nation. While it was a very successful trip professionally, I think it personally and the last month personally have really done a number on me, and forced me to maybe look at some things that I was actively avoiding. In any case, just know whatever this is going to be. Right now I'm thinking I might put it into a playlist called Deep Cuts, because a lot of what I want to talk about are emotional topics. And I think they're important because, one, they're things that I might be aware of, but they aren't necessarily things that I would always say I'm great at. I'm practicing, I'm learning, I'm trying to be better at. Great at giving other people advice about it, but when it comes to practicing it myself, sometimes I struggle with that, and I think that's okay. But when I do talk to people about it, I find, I'm not the only one struggling with it. So like, maybe the conversation had on a larger scale would be important for other people too. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. So what I want to talk about on this first one is conflict and psychological safety. You would be asking me why those two together. And one of the things that I have learned, especially in this last month, is that, it's all wonderful to put into a life book or a business book or give advice to friends about how conflict is healthy and necessary and important. And it is. But we must remember that there is a degree of psychological safety required for people to be able to handle conflict. Our relationships that we have with them might indicate whether or not we're safe or not safe to be able to have those kinds of conversations with. And I think in this day and age where conflict is not an easy thing, and never mind psychological safety is not an easy thing, I think we kind of have to acknowledge, what was different about it, and maybe even acknowledge what the differences in generations. So I kind of grew up in the middle. I grew up in, I'm a Zennial. I think that's the term that people use. So I've had many of experience between people who, for whom conflict in general, sorry for stumbling there, but conflict in general feels like second nature. It's part of who they are, and they find it maybe easy, or maybe if it isn't easy, it's done in a certain way. And I have some thoughts on that. But then there's also a newer generation that processes it differently. And, I kind of see both sides. I would say, like, the old way of confrontation, it might be because you grew up in a larger family. Families have been shrinking in size for some time. Maybe you had great, examples in your home dynamics, and that was why you're able to do so. I think when you have more siblings, though, whether it was good or bad, you kind of have more chance to practice discord, if that makes sense. And I don't mean the gaming platform, chatting platform. I mean how you come apart and come back together. When you live in a house with someone, you're growing up with them, and you fight over something, you're 6 years old, you can't just move out, right? You have to learn how to come back together. So, and I'm not saying that people who don't have siblings can't get along. I'm not trying to say that either. What I'm trying to say is that there's chances to practice. And when we don't have those chances to practice, or as many chances to practice, it means that we have to go actively seeking those skills elsewhere. I think, anybody who grew up in a larger house, or maybe during a certain time, you were, for better or for worse, exposed to bullying or maybe harsher parenting styles, and those are all forms of conflict. And whether or not you learn to deal with them healthily or not is a different conversation, but it might have made you more accustomed to or able to deal with conflict. Jobs that allow for that. Also, somebody who might be in a law enforcement position would have, first of all, be better training, you would hope, and then have more chances to practice that training. So I kind of equate, generationally, but also, based on what you're exposed to. And then I think the new way that we're learning is that sometimes that harshness was not okay and it created its own trauma. And I think as people, we're becoming more aware of our own emotions and being able to advocate for those emotions. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Advocating for yourself is something that I don't think would have been a part of the lexicon for me growing up. It was very much like, suck it up, right? Like that's the way it was. But I could see that change start to happen over time. And I think we have this like in-between space now, where these people who maybe have grown up in this time or with that ideology, it's very quick where if somebody doesn't agree with you or isn't aligned with you, cut them off. We need to create space. And while I think that can definitely be healthy when there's, repeated issues, I have to struggle myself to not run to that right away, because I must remember that there's a whole lot of in between, right? There's a whole lot of factors when you consider when people are misaligned or there's conflict. I think that, perception is highly individual. So like, I might interpret something differently or one event differently than you might interpret it. And that's because, our physical position, literally, like how we see things, how we hear things, our past experiences, and our personal biases and beliefs, they all play a factor in that. If you think about it from the perspective of a car crash, and that came up recently for me, somebody was walking me through. So if you were watching the car crash from this angle, and then somebody was watching it from this angle, you might get two different perspectives on what happened. One person might see an oil slick in the road. One other person might see that the other person was on their phone, right? But if you begin the analysis of the car crash with immediately shouting what happened, you're going to miss all of those in-between factors. And I think that's very true for things that might require conflict as well. So it's important to remember that where your position, your vantage point, so to speak, whether you're the persons in the cars or your bystanders, that changes what you notice and prioritize. Like in a crash scenario, like people close to the impact might pay more attention to like the sounds and the sights. They might remember that last screech. But somebody farther away might, just walk in and see the scene afterwards with a completely different point of view. This affects what you emphasize, and this affects how you might then react. I think if you then add in confirmation bias and assumptions that people can have based on previous relationships or, biases that exist in nature, you might find that your overall outcome of what happened aligns better with your own, existing beliefs and expectations, and that your emotions are playing a strong factor. And I think that is dangerous because we have to listen to our inner guides. I'm not advocating that we don't, but we also have to remember that can tell us a story, and we got to check ourselves. And I don't mean check ourselves outwardly that anybody else can see. I mean internally, we have to really question that. And sometimes that takes time, And when I wanted to talk about this, I was thinking about it from my personal perspective, especially from the last month, but like that conflict can exist in workplace settings too. It can exist in many different places. And, one of my favorite quotes that I discussed with a friend at one point, was the one from Ted Lasso, which I'm sure shows up at other places, but to be curious and not judgmental. And so, I'm not great at it, but I am trying to channel my inner Ted Lasso, because the thing about it is that for me personally, I actually take a lot of time to process things that might make me feel icky, for lack of a better way to put it. I recognize internally that I have my own history and biases that play a factor in how my knee-jerk gut reaction is to something. And I know that I add that layer on top of it. And when I add that layer and then I react right away, I'm not being fair to the person with whom I might have conflict, right? Because that's not their weight, that's not their baggage, but it doesn't change that that's a very real thing for me. So sometimes, for better or for worse, I will remove myself from a situation long enough for me to process what it is I'm exactly feeling, to try to internalize and balance and be fair. Now, I don't know that this is the right process, but this is what has, worked for me to not, essentially lose my shit at everybody for everything that feels like a slight. And I think it's important because that really is about the curiosity side. When I feel a knee-jerk gut reaction to something, I will separate myself and go, okay, so when I felt this, did I remember anything else that had happened to me previously? And if the answer is yes, then I explore that. And I ask if it's adding a layer, right? And then I get curious about why the person might have done that. And then I ask questions and try to get clarification. And I think learning about another viewpoint is healthy and necessary, because when we rush to judgment or we rush to cut someone off without, exploring that, or without kind of diving into both our own processes and what's going on with them, we actually miss a really key opportunity to deepen friendships. I know it's going to sound weird, but some of my best experiences in friendships, the ones that have lasted over time, we've walked through some really big conflicts and difficulties together. And there's something about coming out the other end of that and knowing that you can withstand that, the friendship can withstand that, that is incredibly powerful. But you have to have psychological safety to do that, right? If someone has made you feel unsafe in the past, you can't even begin to address any of those issues. So I think it's important to acknowledge, one, how we process conflict and how we can handle conflict, but also two, how do we create psychological safety within our teams, within our life? How do we get to a place where we can do that now? That could be a 30-minute video, and I've already talked way too long as it is. So I'd like to give maybe 3 tips on what I would say would be, good things to keep in mind when you're trying to create that safety. So I think the first one would be modeling openness and vulnerability. Now, I'm just going to be straight up honest with you. These are not always things that I do easily. Being open and vulnerable is incredibly difficult for me. I have handed that to people in the past and been hurt. And so the more that happens, the harder that becomes. And if you're like me and that's you, take a deep breath. I know. But it's important to remember that what modeling openness and vulnerability really is. It's not about being a martyr. It's not about, saying, oh, it's all my fault and, I'm a bad person. It's about saying, I have room to grow. I have things I can learn. I appreciate your feedback because I'm going to take it and do the best that I can to ingest it. Whether or not I action it is a completely different, conversation surrounding trust. But the point is that modeling openness yourself by receiving the feedback, being able to give feedback in healthy ways, that's important. And being honest about your own imperfections, right? I think if you're dealing with something and somebody took something that you did the wrong way, just being real, that wasn't my intention, not to dismiss their thoughts, because it's important to validate where someone's coming from. But I also think, understanding motivation is personally, I think, pretty key. The other piece is to separate identity from behavior, right? If you think about a person and you think, they did this to me, they did this because they want to hurt me, they did this because they hate me, these are not facts. These are how you feel, probably based on previous actions that have happened. It's for sure the way that I work sometimes. And you really need to change your mode of thinking, that maybe it's not that. Maybe it's more that the behavior is misaligned, right? So like the person's not wrong, they're just reacting based on their own history, their own things, and they may not understand how what they're doing impacts you. And, you know, being able to not judge them, but say, hey, this thing that you're doing, this is how it affects me. You know, that can lead to more conversations, because I for sure know that I don't show up how I mean to sometimes, and I can be a bit overwhelming. And when I'm going through it and when I'm, you know, projecting what I'm projecting, I don't intend to be that way, but it doesn't change that that's how it impacts somebody else. And then I think it's important to recognize the status of your relationship. Like, I think this is something I was kind of alluding to before, but you might have a power dynamic issue. There might be a previous interaction. You know, one person might be more invested than another. I've certainly been in that situation. And those might create their own barriers to psychological safety. You can't have conflict if someone is more worried about other impacts. And that needs to be taken off the table before it can be considered. Sometimes you can do that as the person who may have the power, or as the person who, you know, might be aware of previous interactions. You can take it off the table from the beginning and remove some of the barriers. But the real goal is to be able to address things and discuss them in a healthy way when people are ready to discuss them, and not just put them in a box on the shelf. I'm not sure that I know how to do all of these things. I'm hoping with all of these talks that I plan, it'll be a form of learning and practicing. And maybe if you have advice for me, we can kind of learn on it together. I get emotional about these things because I think these are becoming lost arts. Soft skills maybe, but they come from examples. And if we can all iterate small ways to be better examples for each other, then I think, you know, that would be ideal. And I think of the relationships and friendships that I've been able to make, which are few, but where true vulnerability exists, there is a level and degree of challenging me, even when it's uncomfortable. And so, you know, I want to encourage that and create healthy ways for that to happen. So I don't know if this helps you. Thank you for listening if you've stayed this long, because I know it can be long-winded. Come back for more of these, probably once a week, chats where hopefully we can keep it between 15 and 20 minutes and give you something to think about for your week.